SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Barcelona, the industry-leading conference bringing you the future of sports betting and iGaming.
SBC Summit Barcelona is the fastest growing sports betting and iGaming event in the industry, happening on the 19th to the 21st of September. Experience the entire global industry coverage under one roof, with 15,000 delegates, over 350 exhibitors, and so much more. Get your tickets now at sbcevents.com.
It's now been 5 weeks since we launched our first consultations relating to the government's Gambling Act Review white paper. In that time, we've received over 1,500 responses, as well as talking to interested parties and stakeholders. And that's really important because we want as many voices as possible to be heard during these consultations. However, what is clear from some of those responses and from commentary in the press and on social media is there's a very high level of misunderstanding about what these consultations actually say, particularly when it comes to financial risk checks. That misinformation covers things like suggesting that large numbers of people would be affected by the checks, that personal credit scores can be affected, or they'll be introduced in betting shops and on race courses. What we are trying to do is make sure that when people are responding to our consultation, they're doing so with the right information, and they can help us strike the right balance between the freedoms of people to gamble, but also protecting people from harm. I hope this blog will help people understand the right information about the consultations and help them respond to this really important work.
That was Andrew Rhodes, the CEO of the UK Gambling Commission, providing clarity on what financial risk checks mean following misinformation circulating both the media and on social media. Posted on the UKGC's blog section of its website, this update came a mere 48 hours after Rhodes, alongside Gambling Minister Stewart Andrews, and a host of others who work on the Gambling Act white paper, addressed the Culture, Media and Sports Committee on the recent white paper and gambling regulations. This committee meeting will be the focus of our discussion on today's episode of iGaming Daily, sponsored by SBC Summit Barcelona, as I'm joined by Ted Orme-Claye, who covered the story for SBC News, and Andrew McCarron, SBC's Managing Director. How are you both doing today?
I'm good, thank you, James. Thanks for having me on again this week.
No, it's good to have you on. It was a good write-up that you did for SBC News.
Thank you very much.
Very informative, so it's good to hear. It'd be good to hear your thoughts on this committee face-to-face. Andy, how are you?
I'm British, so I'm going to talk about the weather. We've got a bit of a late summer here in England, and because I'm part Scottish, I am not enjoying it. It's too hot.
What do they call it? They call it like an Indian summer. I think that's the phrase for it. But no, I'm half Scottish as well, and I hate it. It's currently too warm in this room. I'm currently sweating. So bring on the winter, that's what I say. Forget autumn, go straight to winter.
And with that lovely visual...
We have to be descriptive on this podcast.
I mean, going on those comments from Andrew Rhodes at the start, met Andrew at Casino Beats Malta, our event back in May. He's pretty new into the role. That was his first real appearance, chatting to the industry. And he's got his work cut out. I'll say that he's been left quite a tricky legacy, but I don't know. I find it a bit rich in passing the buck to. I think you described it as misinformation. I'm not sure Andrew Rhodes did, but it wasn't too far away from it. Misinformation in the media about what was in the white papers. I think part of the problem with that was the white papers were quite confusing and quite vague about certain areas like affordability checks. Where there's been not enough information, and then they've dropped in a little bit of information, and then everyone's had to speculate around it. So it's it's a bit easy just to blame all the media all the time, when sometimes it's endemic of the communications not being what it ought to be.
Yeah, no, I can see where you're coming from with that one. I also remember that Andrew Rhodes was part of an upcoming kind of documentary that we did at Casino Beats, and he was talking about the stake limits from the white paper. And I remember when it was first announced, he gave some great insights. I'm not going to spoil too much from the documentary that's coming up. But there was, when it was first announced, I do remember it was very vague, and it was very anticlimactic of what we wanted or what we was teased and actually what we got. And I think I always mention it when we talk white paper when you're on, Andy, your further consultation comment. keeps reoccurring, and it's accurate because this is what it is. It's just further consultations moving forward. But I think before we kind of move on to the select committee, we're from the UK. We've got clarity on kind of what this is. I mean, some people in the UK might not. But Andy, you mentioned off air to me that you actually attended some of these in your past.
Oh God, yeah, back in the day when I was based down in London, and mainly when the original Gambling Act 2005 was going through Parliament. I ended up in Westminster quite often to see some of the discussions. And what these questions were earlier on this week in Parliament was what we called the Select Committee. And the Select Committee, each governmental department will have one, and it's basically a collection of MPs from all different parties who will scrutinise some of the big issues at the time, and they'll bring in and have the power to ask searching questions of the people involved in that. So this week they've had the Gambling Commission in, and they've also had the latest Minister for Gambling and Culture Secretary in. And this is the last set of interviews from this research into gambling regulation that they're doing. There's been a set of ones. They've had the BGC in, they've had some of the problem gambling campaigners in during this whole process. And these interviews this week were the last one as part of this investigation, and maybe 3 to 6 months' time, we'll see the Select Committee's report and recommendations into what they found out.
Cool. And what we're going to do on this podcast, we're going to listen to some audio snippets and kind of just get Ted and Andy's reaction on what was said. And Andy, you mentioned about kind of research. One of the comments was being behind the curve, and I'm just going to get that audio clip up now and we'll listen to it and then comment on that.
I think we're probably behind the curve in terms of research, and I think this is why I think the introduction of the levy actually gives us a sort of generational change, if you like, in terms of the funding, and gives us an opportunity to have some of the best research in the world, so that we can identify what is the actual what are the issues that need to be addressed in this area. And that's what we've tried to do very much with this white paper, very heavy on being evidence-led on what data we have and what research we have available to us at the moment.
So that was Stewart Andrew. And Ted, I believe this was an angle you went for your article. Just kind of reflecting on that and kind of why you went with that angle. Do you want to just give us your thoughts on it?
Well, there was a nice couple of buzzwords in there for us, wasn't there? About obviously he's mentioned the levy, he mentioned how that's going to be a generational change moving forward with research. One of the reasons I kind of went with this is because, and he also said evidence-led, which is something that we've heard just non-stop throughout this whole review. But that's the thing, this review has been going on for 2 years, and now we're getting told that, apparently we need more research as part of these consultations. It just made me think what research has been done during those 2 years. How come we haven't got what we need as a result of this huge legislative overhaul that we've seen? And then obviously they mentioned the RET levy. They're hoping that this is going to be the thing that fixes this issue, that this will generate the funding via a mandatory payment from bookmakers and casinos and so on to fund greater research of certain areas. They want to potentially look at things like advertising, the impact of advertising on people, just sort of the general societal impact of gambling. That one of the things that really came into my head was there's a few bookmakers I've spoken to who use the term that the white paper's almost kicked the can further down the road with regards to these more consultations coming in. And I just think the government almost telling us, we need more research is in some ways is a bit indicative of that, in my opinion.
Well, there's research and there's evidence-led, and these days there's so much hokey research out there. You can choose your own evidence to make whatever decision you want to. The Gambling Commission have been particularly lax with this because they've been using some of the fines that they've received to commission some of these bodies to do research, but it's been completely haphazard. There's been no measurement to see if it's been successful. It's not been coordinated, and it's a complete mess. And what makes me laugh about everyone saying how this levy will be, transformational. It's not bringing in any more money. All it is complicating how that money's distributed. It's nonsense.
Okay, we're going to go to another audio clip, and this was something when before the white paper was announced, everyone was kind of hoping there was big changes in relation to advertising and betting advertising. This was one which was probably the best way to say it, a wet blanket. Just nothing really there was no big change that people was expecting. Listen to the clip and then we'll just respond to that.
I think, again, it's important to point out that we went on an evidence-led approach on this. So we looked at the types of advertising that may potentially lead people into gambling harm. So that is direct. It's also important to say that actually some changes have been happening in this area. Some rules have been tightened up. But we have gone very much on the evidence. There's little evidence that exposure to advertising alone causes people to enter into gambling harm, although we do recognise, of course, that it can perhaps disproportionately affect those that are going through gambling harm. But there is clear evidence that the sort of personalised direct marketing can pose a risk, and that's why a number of changes have been made in those areas.
So there's very little evidence that, according to Andrews, that gambling advertising has any harm for problem gamblers. Yet the Premier League have banned shirt sponsorships voluntarily from 2025. Thoughts on probably why the Premier League have taken such drastic actions, and just because everything is evidence-led, why is there still kind of uproar with sports gambling? Sports betting gambling at the moment with advertising.
Yeah, I like the use of the word evidence-led once again there by the Minister. Shows that the government is still very keen on that one. As you said before we played the clip, James, the Premier League took the decision voluntarily. They had a vote. The vast majority of clubs voted to remove betting sponsorships from the front of their shirts from 2026-27 season onwards. They're going to keep sleeve sponsorships and logos. I think the main reason they did that is just because there's been a lot of this. The betting shirt sponsorships have really fallen under the public spotlight in recent years. There's been a lot of fan backlash against new deals being signed, and I think the Premier League was really just sort of responding to that. Some people might have argued that they jumped before they were pushed, sort of thing, with the white paper coming up. I don't really quite see it that way, but there's certainly some people out there who have that view. In the white paper itself, the main thing it brought in was a code of conduct on how sponsorships should be conducted. But obviously, a lot of campaigners, such as Carolyn Harris, for example, who's chair of the all-party gambling harm group, have been very vocal in wanting this to be changed. I think the main reason for this is simply that it's just one of the most visible forms of advertising and visible forms of marketing. Some people as well are concerned about how younger football fans might be exposed to betting. But yeah, again, from what we've seen from this, the government are very steadfast in their opinion that it needs to be, as they keep saying, evidence-led. And apparently we need even more research into this before they're going to budge on their current stance on it.
See, it's the main reason why it's been banned and there's been this backlash is because there's too much of it. It's not. If there was one gambling brand, say Betway on West Ham, it's been a good long-term partner with them, I don't think people would bat an eyelid. But you've got these Asian brands coming in here and basically using the credibility of the Premier League to make their brands feel credible. From a problem gambling perspective, these brands don't even want UK. They don't even want UK custom. So they're not really generating that UK stuff. the front of shirt stuff, it doesn't make any sense at all, considering you can still do front of shirt on the other leagues, and you can do sleeves, you can do perimeter board stuff. It's not addressing what the issue is. And what they mention on there is, individual targeting of people who have got gambling issues. Well, what they need to do there is enable the affiliates who've got some of these marketing lists, and that's how they make their money, and that's how the marketing bit works, to have access to these people who've self-excluded in GamStop. But at the moment, there's no mechanism to allow them to do that. So there's real potential there, that people are targeted unintentionally, who are vulnerable in that front. So it just needs more overall thinking, some more holistic thinking around the things. Because at the moment, for some reason, the Gambling Commission are not interested in affiliates. They leave the policing of those up to the operators themselves, whereas many other markets have regulated the affiliates, and many affiliates want to be regulated.
Ted, there was something you mentioned. You mentioned the amount of, was it 2 teams that opposed?
Not opposed. I think they abstained from the vote.
Abstained from the vote. See, it's interesting for me that the white paper was announced, and then the Premier League voluntarily did the 2025 ban on sponsorship, voluntary. But then since then, I think we've seen countless actual sponsors from Premier League clubs with operators or sports betting orientated firms, and it doesn't seem to have changed the dynamics. It's just, I feel like clubs are now like, we've got 2 years to get the money in before we have to ban them for front of shirts. Let's kind of do a hard push. That's my view. It could be completely different.
Well, look at it this way. You're a sports betting brand. Who do you want? Who is your customer? It's people who use sports books. Is there any other industry whose customer base overlaps so closely with those that watch sport? I can't think of it. I mean, you can talk about cars, but it's not got that in that Venn diagram. They're off all over the show. So those sports fans are much more valuable to a sports betting brand, because they're 80% more likely to be interested in their product. So that's why there's a lot of activity from marketing of these betting brands, because that's their audience. Unfortunately, it just means it makes it too much and it's too overpowering.
Okay, so the final clip was actually shared on X, formerly known as Twitter, and considering this had been 2 years in the making, probably even longer before that, and there was no impact assessment when releasing the white paper, and this was what an MP asked at the select committee.
If it is such a significant policy intervention, with a large industry, there's lots of implications for health matters we've heard about, for employment, for tax revenue, and so on for the government. So why isn't it worthy of an impact assessment?
Well, I think
the government does impact assessments on,
Yes.
I turn up. I'm required by the whips to turn up to all these little statutory instrument committees, and I always read the impact assessment, because that's where you actually find out the what's really going on. But so why isn't there an impact assessment on this very important major policy intervention?
I mean, I think that I probably need to come back to you, if I'm going to be really honest with you, Mr. Brennan, and to the committee with respect, because I wouldn't want to sort of give any misinformation.
I get a bit fed up with ministers actually saying they need to come back to me when I ask about impact assessments.
Right, okay.
Because, it's, well, look,
your point.
This is a huge thing.
Mm.
So, Andy, I'll come to you first on, can you just explain what an impact assessment is?
Yeah, well, the full name is actually Regulatory Impact Assessment, and what they did make these used to be mandatory for. I'm pretty sure it was white papers, but certainly for something that would recommend a changing of the law. And it's where you actually see the homework. It tends to be a page at the end. They're standardized, and it says, this recommendation, what effect will it have on the market? Will it increase this, increase that? And it kind of totes them all up. And, if it's quite draconian regulation, it tells you how much it's going to cost the industry. It tells you how much it's going to cost the exchequer in taxes. And, it's where you see the homework's done. It's really interesting. As that MP says, if you get one of these, going straight to the regulatory impact assessment actually shows you what impacts these things are going to have. They're not always accurate, but at least it shows that they've been thinking about it in those terms. But once they got made mandatory, what happened is people started tweaking what these reports were. So if it looks like a white paper, it might not technically have been a white paper, so it doesn't need the regulatory impact assessment. So I was surprised that this one didn't have it in. And it's just kind of smacks of everything being last minute, a bit slapdash, even after 2 years. It's ridiculous that there isn't that one, but it'd have been an extra chunk of time. It'd probably taken another 2 months to get a good impact assessment because it's quite a big white paper. And from what we can tell, it was changing right up until it was published. So where normally you'd have these things sort of running in parallel, I guess it was impossible for this one. But yeah, it's like I say, it's where the politicians and the lawmakers can show that they've done the homework, and it doesn't seem to be the case in this white paper.
That could be an overview of our government at the moment of not doing their homework.
Yeah, I think both the MP and Andy have really hit the nail on the head there. I think it is a bit ridiculous that we haven't got an impact assessment to look at what is, as that member of parliament noted, these legislative changes are going to have a big impact on this industry. As the BGC have pointed out regularly over the past 2 years, the betting industry makes a huge economic contribution to the UK, employs over 100,000 people. And then there's also the societal impacts as well that we've kept on hearing about from both campaigners and the gambling industry, the different competing viewpoints that have been on that. This legislative overhaul is something that is going to affect the industry, it's going to affect sport, it's going to affect the economy, and it could potentially affect a lot of people's lives as a result of that. So, yeah, the fact we haven't got an impact assessment, coupled with the fact that apparently we need even more research on some of these areas, yeah, it really makes you think what's been going on over the past 2 years. And I think a lot of it might be to do with, as we've said, with the sort of state of the government. Stewart Andrews is, I've lost count now, he's well over the 6th minister to have handled this paper, isn't he? More if you include under your parliamentary secretary of states and so on. There's been so many politicians in charge of this thing. If they're half decent at football, they might be able to get a pretty decent Sunday League side out of it. There's so many of them. So yeah, it is very indicative of how chaotic and unorganised this very important review has been.
And this kind of loops around to the clip we played of Andrew Rhodes at the top about there being all these different interpretations of what was in the white paper. Well, if they'd have known and put it in a regulatory impact assessment as to what these affordability checks would mean, there wouldn't be quite as much speculation because, nature abhors a vacuum, and if there's not much detail, people will fill it with whatever they can, especially on Twitter.
X. You mean X?
No, I'm not calling it that.
The platform formerly known as Twitter.
Well, we could talk about this for another hour or so. I had a few more points. I wanted to talk about some new health survey that was announced that'll be coming in the coming months. I wanted to go into some compliance, but we've just run out of time. What I will say to the listeners out there, I will leave a link in the description to Ted Orme-Claye's article on SBC News. I'll also leave a Casino Beats version as well, because there's an online casino angle to all this, to the white paper. Ted, Andy, thank you for joining us today. And to the listeners out there, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Barcelona, being held at the Fira Barcelona Montjuic on the 19th to the 21st of September. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network, or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.